Sunday dinner. 4 people at the table, and one of them is a killer. The poison was in only one glass, not in the pitcher, in one specific glass. This means one thing. The killer knew beforehand exactly where the victim would sit, and they acted in plain sight. Without a tremor, without panic. Like someone who has done this before, or someone who doesn't consider it a crime at all. The unmarked sedan eased to a stop at the curb, but Detective Archer made no move to get out. He lit a cigarette, cracking the window just an inch, and studied the mansion through the veil of blue-gray smoke. It was a 2-story Georgian revival, a paragon of pre-war symmetry with its neat rows of windows and columned portico, all painted a stark white that seemed to repel the gloomy October sky. The lawn was flawlessly manicured, the 4 arborvitae sculpted into perfect spheres, 2 flanking each side of the gate. Everything was measured, everything in its place. Archer took a long drag, his eyes narrowing. A hairline crack snaked down from the cornice, as fine and subtle as a scar from an old wound. It traced a diagonal path across the stucco toward the ground floor, where it vanished beneath a blanket of ivy that had been trimmed with an almost obsessive precision just below the windowsill. On the second floor, the shutters were drawn closed, both windows, left and right, at 10 in the morning on a weekday. The house stood there, staring back at him with its blind, shuttered eyes. A young patrolman, shifting his weight by the gate, snapped to attention at the sight of Archer. He was maybe 25, rosy-cheeked, a rehearsed report already forming in his eyes. "No one's entered or exited since our arrival, Detective. We've sealed the connecting door to the garage. The body was transferred to the morgue at 8:40 a.m., and the paramedics filed a preliminary report." Archer nodded, grinding his cigarette into the asphalt with his heel. He straightened his tie, already askew. The worst of it, he thought, as he pushed open the gate, was already inside. The front door swung open before his finger could even press the doorbell. Archer made a mental note. They were waiting for him. Watching from a window, listening for his footsteps on the gravel path. A person who opens the door at the precise moment you intend to ring is a person who controls their space. Helen Reed was a small woman of 72 with a ramrod straight spine and cold blue eyes. She wore a severe dark blue wool dress and a single strand of pearls. Not a single silver hair had escaped the tight bun at the nape of her neck. He saw no tremor in her wrist. Archer had seen widows at their own husbands' funerals who looked more undone. "Detective Archer?" Her voice was quiet and steady. "Please come in." There was no hello, no finally, no I'm so glad you're here. Just a simple come in, the words of a hostess obligated to receive a guest who has arrived at an inconvenient time. He stepped into the foyer. The scent hit him immediately. Dried lavender and floor wax. That distinct, sterile smell of a house cleaned too often and too thoroughly. Dark oak panels lined the walls, and the parquet floor seemed to have absorbed decades of footsteps. A large mirror in a heavy, tarnished frame hung opposite the entrance. Archer caught a glimpse of his own reflection. A rumpled suit, a loosened tie, a tired face. Beside him stood the reflection of Helen Reed, as flawless as a porcelain doll in a china cabinet. She turned and moved deeper into the house, expecting him to follow without a backward glance. The dining room greeted him with a heavy gloom. Thick velvet curtains were drawn halfway, casting a slanted, dusty shaft of daylight across the center of a long oak table set with a starched white cloth. In the middle sat an untouched tray with a pot of cold tea. From a corner, a grandfather clock ticked with a deep, measured rhythm. Archer paused in the doorway, taking it all in. 3 people were seated at the table. At the near end, a thin woman of about 48, with pale skin and gray eyes, stared into a teacup In front of her sat an uneaten slice of apple pie, its crust already dry. Anne, the widow. Her hands were clasped in her lap, a fact Archer deduced from the pronounced tension in her shoulders. On the opposite side, a younger woman slouched in her chair with a theatrical carelessness. Dark hair, lipstick too bright for a morning of mourning, and a quick, defiant gaze. She looked at Archer as if he were a door-to-door salesman peddling something useless. Irene, the sister. At the far end of the table, shrouded in shadow, a young man sat hunched over. His blonde hair was disheveled, his broad shoulders drawn up to his ears. He hid his face in his hands, and Archer could only see the back of his head and the fine, almost imperceptible tremor in his shoulders. Daniel, the nephew. 3 people, separated by a dead silence that had nothing to do with grief. Grief unites. This silence divided. Archer took off his coat and draped it over the back of an empty chair. Helen agreed to speak first, or rather she volunteered before he could even ask. Archer recognized the maneuver for what it was. They sat a few feet from the others, near a cabinet filled with porcelain. Helen kept her hands folded in her lap, her back straight, her eyes fixed on him with a steady, unnerving focus. Paul was the rock of this family, she began. He ran his business honestly, transparently. After his father died, he was the one who took charge of everything. These Sunday dinners were his idea, a way to keep us connected when we were all busy with our own lives, she continued, her voice even. Did he often have conflicts with his family? A momentary pause, barely perceptible. Every family has its disagreements, Detective. Paul could be demanding, but it came from a place of responsibility, not cruelty. With Irene? They're siblings, she said, her tone unchanged. They always bickered. It's normal. Archer studied her. He was looking at a woman who described her murdered son with the same detached tone one might use to give a reference for a former employee. There was no tremor in her voice, no tears in her eyes, none of the involuntary hitches in breath that are impossible to fake. Helen Reed was not losing control. She was building a narrative. He jotted a few notes in his pad, small, cramped script, and then stood. He escorted Irene into the foyer for their conversation. She leaned against the oak panels and crossed her arms, her posture telegraphing that this interview was a mere formality she intended to endure. A sacred tradition? She echoed when he mentioned the Sunday dinners. She scoffed. You could call it that. Or you could call it a weekly inspection, where Paul could make sure none of us had stepped out of line. So he controlled the family financially. Controlled? Irene raised an eyebrow. He dictated. Mom's retirement fund, my mortgaged condo, that was his idea. Daniel works for room and board. Anne hasn't signed a single document without his permission. She shrugged. He kept us all on a leash and called it care. Who wanted him dead? Irene paused for a moment, then spread her hands in a theatrical gesture. It would be easier to ask who didn't. Look at Anne. She's a rich widow now. You should ask her. Archer watched her. She spoke with a certain relish, too much, too eagerly, casting suspicion on everyone. It could mean anything, from simple malice to a calculated strategy. He made another note. Anne wouldn't look at him. She had moved to an armchair by the window, clutching a teacup in both hands, though the tea inside was long cold. Her answers were barely whispers. Are you feeling all right? Archer asked. Yes. Did anyone threaten your husband? I don't know. Did he have any enemies among his business partners? I don't know. Archer let the silence hang in the air. It was a technique he often used. A person with nothing to hide would eventually feel compelled to fill it. Anne did not. She sat with whitened knuckles, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere past his shoulder. Anne, he said softly. "Were you afraid of your husband?" Her shoulders twitched. It wasn't an answer, but a physical reaction. She didn't say a word, but it was enough. Archer understood. She wasn't afraid of his questions, or of the memories, or of the investigation. She was afraid of someone in this house, someone who was still here. Daniel was still sitting where Archer had first seen him, in the far corner of the dining room. When Archer sat down opposite him, the young man lifted his head, and Archer saw his eyes. They were light brown, swollen, open, like the eyes of someone who has nothing to hide because he doesn't know how. "Tell me about Paul Reed," Archer said. Daniel clenched his jaw, gathering his strength. "He got me out of there," he said finally. 10 years ago, he drove up to my town and just took me. I didn't ask him to. He just said, 'Pack your things.'" His voice broke. He paused. "He gave me everything. A job, a place to live. He let me breathe." "Did he have enemies?" Daniel looked at him with such genuine bewilderment that Archer almost expected him to ask, "What are enemies?" Everyone respected him. He could be strict, but... Daniel trailed off again, rubbing his palms on his jeans. "Why are you asking me this? Isn't it obvious who could have done this?" "No," Archer said. "It isn't." He rose and went back to his notes. Archer had seen hundreds of people lie from that same chair, with those same swollen eyes. Skilled, practiced liars, convinced of their own invulnerability. Daniel was not one of them. The young man's grief was real, as tangible as the grease under his fingernails. That, Archer knew, made him vulnerable. He returned to the center of the dining room. "I need to inspect the deceased's personal study immediately," he announced, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'll ask you all to remain where you are." He wasn't looking at the grieving family. He was looking at a group of suspects. Anne's head snapped up. Irene sat up straighter in her chair. Daniel glanced uncertainly toward the hallway door. And then Helen stood. She moved around the table so silently, Archer could have sworn her feet never touched the floor. She positioned herself between him and the doorway to the hall. A small, fragile woman with silver hair, standing as if the entire mansion, with all its secrets, was massed behind her. "Detective." Her voice remained perfectly level. "Paul did not tolerate anyone invading his personal space. Please respect his wishes. We should wait for the attorney." A pause. Archer didn't move. 4 paces separated them. He understood that this was not a request. It was a direct order, delivered by someone accustomed to being obeyed. And it meant there was something in that study she was determined he would not see. "Mrs. Reed," Archer said evenly, "this is no longer his personal space. It's a room relevant to a murder investigation." He took a step forward. Helen held her ground for another long, hard second before she yielded. She didn't just step aside. She retreated, like a player making a tactical move rather than conceding defeat. The hallway was long and dark. The study door was at the very end, dark wood with a bronze handle. It was locked. Archer turned around. "The key." Silence. Helen stood a few feet behind him, her hands clasped in front of her. Her face was a blank mask, her lips pressed into a thin, straight line. Archer reached into the side pocket of his jacket, a small, flat set of lockpicks. He'd carried them for 11 years, ever since a case where he'd spent 3 hours waiting for a locksmith in front of a locked door. He didn't wait anymore. 2 seconds of work. A dry, sharp click. The sound shot down the corridor, bounced off the wood panels, and echoed back. In the dead silence of the house, it was unexpectedly loud, like something irreversible. Archer pushed the door open and walked in. The study was an alien presence in the house. A glass desk on chrome legs, A modern black leather chair, cold light from recessed fixtures, a panoramic window overlooking the garden. The scent of expensive cologne and leather-bound books was the only thing connecting this room to the rest of the mansion. No oak panels, no lavender. Paul Reed had built himself a different world in here. Archer stood in the middle of the room, his phone vibrating in his pocket. He answered. "Archer." "Detective." The medical examiner's voice was as dispassionate as ever. "We have the preliminary tox report. It's a veterinary neurotoxin, a rare compound used in industrial livestock operations. But that's not the main thing." Archer stared at his reflection in the glass desktop. A rumpled suit, a heavy gaze. "I'm listening." "We've tested everything from the table. The pitcher of iced tea is clean. The glasses belonging to Helen, Irene, and Anne are clean. Daniel Price's glass is clean. The poison was only in the victim's glass. A significant concentration. Nothing else was touched." Archer said nothing for several seconds. "Say that again." "The poison was only in Paul Reed's glass. The killer didn't put it in the pitcher. They dosed a single glass." Archer pocketed his phone. He stood motionless, staring at the glass desk, replaying Irene's words, tossed out so casually, almost a footnote to her statement. And then the nephew spilled some water, so Mom and Paul switched places. They had switched places, already at the table. It meant one thing. The killer poisoned the glass after Paul had moved. The poison found its target with surgical precision, after the seating change, in front of everyone, in a room with 4 witnesses. Archer felt a cold, sharp focus move between his shoulder blades. It wasn't fear. It was something else. Recognition. He was dealing with someone who hadn't acted in a panic, not someone who had slipped poison into a pitcher in the kitchen and prayed. The person who did this wasn't afraid of witnesses. They worked among them. Not despite their presence, but by using it. Archer turned back to the open study door. There, at the end of the dark corridor, stood Helen Reed. Her back was straight, her hands were folded. Her gaze met his and did not waver. The phone rang at 7:23 a.m. Archer was already awake. He was sitting in his armchair across from a corkboard where he'd pinned the witness statements and a diagram of the dining room. For 2 hours he had been staring at a single point, the spot where Paul had been sitting. His coffee was long cold. Outside, the November dawn was breaking with a slow reluctance, as if it, too, had no desire to start the day. "Archer," he answered. Finally, Captain Miller's voice knew no quiet tones even at this hour. "This case has eyes on it from downtown. I called you twice last night. Where the hell have you been?" "Working." "Working," Miller grunted with the kind of cynical rasp that passed for a laugh. "You seen the papers? Murder at Sunday dinner. Catchy headline, I'll give them that. Now I've got the press office calling me every 3 hours. I need a name on a report, Archer, not a psychological profile, not your theories on family dynamics. A name, a date, and a signature. You get me?" "I get you." "Good. You've got 3 days. After that, I'm closing this myself with what we've got." Miller hung up. Archer set the phone down and stared at the board. 3 days. He got up and walked to the window. The East River below was a slick gray ribbon under a matching sky. Smoke curled from a stack somewhere over in Queens. He lit a cigarette by the open window, replaying the scene in his mind. The table, the pitcher, the glasses, the switch. The killer hadn't been nervous. The killer had operated, unshaken, in a room with 4 other people. That kind of composure isn't an accident. It's practiced. The financial records arrived by 10. Archer laid them out on his desk in a precise row, from left to right. Anne, Irene, Daniel. Anne Reed. A life insurance payout of $1.2 million. Archer looked at the number twice, though he'd understood it the first time. 20 years of marriage to a man who signed every document for her, and now a sum that could take her anywhere. Let her start completely over. For a woman who couldn't lift her eyes from the floor during questioning, this was a fortune. Irene Reed. Archer sifted through the papers slowly. 3 payday loans in the last 18 months, each with an interest rate that made his jaw tighten. Her condo was mortgaged to the hilt. Pawnshop receipts showed her jewelry was long gone. And hovering over this mess was Paul Reed's name, the one person who could have stopped the bleeding with a single call to his accountant, if he had wanted to. Daniel Price. Archer stared at the empty file for a long time. No official income existed, no bank transfers, no employment contract. Just cash, which Paul had apparently doled out by hand. A man living in someone else's house, working for room and board, with no paper trail to prove he was ever truly part of this family. 3 motives, 3 clear-cut theories. Archer turned the files face down and rubbed the old scar on his left palm. He met Daniel at a diner on Astoria Boulevard, a small place with plastic chairs and a TV broadcasting the news on mute. Archer had chosen it deliberately, far from the mansion, far from the family's world. 2 teas and paper cups sat between them. Daniel sat with his shoulders hunched, turning the cup in his hands. His fingers were long, with old calluses on the knuckles. A dark line of grime that no soap could touch remained under his nails. Archer didn't rush it. He started talking about engines, asked about an old Ford Falcon he claimed he'd seen. Daniel looked up. His answer was short, technically precise. Archer asked another question, then another. 20 minutes later, Daniel was speaking almost normally. "Uncle Paul said we were going to install a lift in the garage by summer," he said, his voice cracking. "I was already looking at models." Silence fell between them. "Was he on edge lately?" Archer asked, his tone even as if he were still talking about car lifts. Daniel paused. "He wasn't himself," he said, rubbing his palms together. "Especially after Aunt Irene showed up. She came by about 3 weeks before. Anyway, they were arguing in the dining room. I could hear her yelling from the garage. I couldn't make out the words, but I definitely heard, 'my fair share.' He came out through the kitchen afterward, just stood by the wall and smoked a cigarette. He almost never smoked. I asked him what was wrong, but he just waved me off, like, 'stay out of it.'" Archer took a small sip of the bad tea. "He didn't say anything else?" "No. He rarely talked about family stuff." Daniel stared into his cup again. "Only once he said he wanted to fix something. I didn't know what he meant." He arrived back at the mansion at 1:30 without calling ahead. Helen opened the door with the same flawless anticipation as the first time. Archer noted it without comment, gave her a nod, and walked straight to the staircase. "Detective," her voice stopped him at the first step. "Irene is resting." "That's fine," Archer said, and continued up. He knocked once and opened the door without waiting for an answer. Irene's room was smaller and far messier than he'd expected. Clothes were strewn about, glossy magazines littered the floor, and a mug with the dried dregs of coffee sat on the windowsill. Irene was half reclined on the bed with a laptop on her knees. When she saw Archer in the doorway, her expression shifted in a single second from surprise to irritation to something he identified as alarm. "What are you doing here without calling?" she snapped. "My fair share?" Archer said, cutting straight to the point. "What were you demanding from Paul?" Something flickered in her eyes, as fast as the shadow of a passing cloud, and then it was gone. Irene set the laptop on the blanket beside her. "That's a family matter." "It's my matter now." "Listen, cop," She sat up, and her voice took on that sharp, venomous edge Archer recognized from the foyer. "My brother and I had financial disagreements. All siblings do. That doesn't make me a murderer."
"You threatened him," Archer stated.
"I have proof." He didn't. Not yet. But Irene didn't know that. Her shoulders tensed. Her eyes darted to the laptop. "I'll need to take your computer," Archer said, taking a step toward the bed. She lunged for it before he could extend his hand, grabbing the laptop with both hands and pulling it fiercely to her chest. "Don't touch it! You have no right!" she yelled, her tone no longer sarcastic but sharp with something close to panic. She tried to turn, to shield it with her back. Archer caught her wrist, gently but without hesitation, and took the laptop with his other hand. The struggle lasted all of 6 seconds. Breathing heavily, Irene pressed herself against the wall, staring at him as if he'd just stolen something far more valuable than a piece of plastic and metal. Archer tucked the laptop under his arm. "You'll be given a receipt." Back in his office, under the dead glare of a fluorescent lamp, he opened Irene's email client. The messages were arranged in chronological order, a timeline of decay. The first, from May, was almost polite. "Paul, we need to discuss Dad's estate. I'm open to whatever works." The subsequent emails grew shorter, angrier. By August, the tone had shifted. "You know damn well the house was supposed to be split evenly. Dad promised." In September, it was a direct threat. "If you don't find a way to pay me what I'm legally owed, I will make you regret it." The last email, sent 2 days before Paul's death, consisted of a single sentence. "Time's up." Archer read it twice. Then he leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. Motive. Threat. A date. It was more than enough for a report, but his gut, that old nagging dog that had been chewing at him from the start, wasn't satisfied. Irene was too obvious, too loud. Real killers don't send warning emails 48 hours before they act. The next day he drove back to the mansion on Elm Street. The house greeted him with the same scent of lavender and wax. This time, however, Helen didn't open the door in anticipation. He rang, and the young patrolman on duty let him in. The dining room was empty. Archer stood in the center of the room, listening to the silence, punctuated only by the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. He walked the length of the table, replaying the scene in his mind. Sunday dinner, 4 people in their seats, a pitcher in the middle, spilled water, a change of places. After Paul had moved, someone would have had to approach his glass, produce a vial, open it, dispense the drops, and conceal it again, in plain sight of everyone. It was impossible. Archer paused by the china cabinet and slowly turned his head to the left. The wall beside the cabinet appeared solid, the same pale gray paint, the same paneled geometry. But there it was, a faint vertical line in the wall, just to the right of the cabinet. He stepped closer and ran a finger over the paint. Beneath the layers, he could feel the distinct edge of a rectangle, roughly 1 foot by 1.5 feet. A dumbwaiter. He found the recessed handle and pulled. The small door didn't budge. He braced his foot against the baseboard and pulled harder. There was a muted, protesting screech of metal, but still no movement. He took out his flashlight, aimed it at the crack along the top edge, and peered inside. In the narrow gap, he saw a splinter of wood, long and thin, driven into the track like a wedge. It wasn't accidental. It had been inserted deliberately, with force. Archer straightened up, his eyes fixed on the painted-over door. This hadn't been done a year ago. The paint in the crack was as fresh and white as the paint on the wall. His phone rang while he was still standing there, flashlight in hand. "Detective," the ME's voice was tinged with that restrained excitement of someone bearing news they hadn't yet decided was good. "We went through the trash cans outside the house, Both of them. Buried under Sunday's leftovers, at the very bottom, we found an eyedropper. The disposable plastic kind. Preliminary test is positive. Same toxin.
Archer put the flashlight away.
Send me a picture. A minute later, an image appeared on his screen. A small plastic tube held in a pair of tweezers set against an evidence bag. A standard drugstore dropper. The kind you could buy anywhere, no questions asked. Archer stared at it for a long moment. Then he walked out of the dining room, down the hall, and through the kitchen, past a monotonously dripping faucet and a row of spice jars, one of which stood slightly apart, its label missing. He glanced out the back window. The trash cans were less than 20 feet from the kitchen door. The bulletin went out to every pharmacy in the city by that evening. The replies started trickling in the next morning. Archer sat in his office, nursing his 4th cup of coffee and reading the terse responses. No, not in stock. Discontinued. It was nearly 10:30 at night when his phone rang again. Hello, this is Reliable Pharmacy on 31st Avenue. Is this Detective Archer? I was told to call you directly. Yes, this is he. You're looking for a veterinary medication. The voice was old, deliberate, with pauses between phrases. We had it. It's rare, which is why I remember. Sold a vial about 3 weeks ago, maybe a little more, to a young man. Archer grabbed a pen. The pharmacy was tucked into the ground floor of an old brick building, looking as though it hadn't been updated since the 80s. Archer arrived 20 minutes after the call. The pharmacist was a short man in his 70s, wearing a white coat with his initials embroidered on the pocket. He put on his glasses and waited patiently as Archer laid out the photographs. That's him, the old man said, pointing without a moment's hesitation. That one. I'd know him anywhere. He was very nervous, said it was for his dog, some rare disease. The pharmacist took off his glasses and cleaned them on his coat. I even explained the dosage. He just nodded, seemed distracted. He had such a lost look on his face. I remember thinking he was taking it awfully hard for someone else's dog. His finger was resting on Daniel's photograph. Archer had the warrant by the next morning. He arrived on Elm Street at noon with 2 uniforms. Daniel was in the garage. Archer could hear the dull clang of a wrench against metal as he approached. When they entered through the back, the young man looked up from under the hood of an old Ford and stared at Archer with the expression of someone who has just been told bad news they were already expecting. Not surprised, just tired. Daniel Price, Archer said. Daniel slowly set the wrench on the car's fender and wiped his hands on a rag. They brought him into the dining room. Archer read him his rights. For the first time, Daniel stood straight and looked directly at him. There was no anger in his eyes, no fear, just the look of a man who has been betrayed before and has learned to expect it. The handcuffs clicked shut. Helen was standing in the doorway, pressing a folded linen handkerchief to her lips, her shoulders trembling slightly. "Oh, Danny, dear God," she whispered. "How could you?" Archer watched her. There wasn't a single false note in her voice, not one. Her sorrow was as flawless as the pearls around her neck, and that's what bothered him. He followed the officers out of the house and paused on the walkway to light a cigarette in the wind. The case was closed. Motive, means, witness, evidence. Miller would get his name on the report. Daniel, in handcuffs, disappeared through the gate. Archer stood there, looking at the perfect white facade, at the crack that ran from the cornice down to the ivy. Something about it was all too polished, too complete, as if someone had rehearsed the finale for a very long time. He ground out the cigarette and got in his car. It's all too neat, he thought. Too perfect. Captain Miller was pouring brandy with the satisfaction of a man whose work was finally done. His office smelled of cinnamon cookies from a tin on the windowsill and some cloyingly sweet perfume. On his desk lay a blue folder, neatly bound, with the name Price on a white label. Miller valued tidy paperwork. It was the one thing Archer respected about him.
"To a clean close," Miller announced, holding out a glass. Fast, quiet, no loose ends. Archer took the glass, raised it to his lips, but didn't drink. Miller clapped him on the shoulder, a heavy, proprietary gesture, and leaned back in his chair. "I've already reported it upstairs. They're putting you in for a commendation. I know it's not your style to get bogged down in one case. You wanted this wrapped up so you could move on. Well, you got it. For once, you didn't go stirring up trouble where there was none." Where there was none. Archer set the untouched brandy on the desk. Miller didn't notice. He was already flipping through another file, his mind on the next neat set of statistics. Archer left the office and stood for a moment in the hallway, staring at a framed photo on the wall. The cold feeling in his gut wouldn't go away. His phone rang as he was walking down the precinct steps. "Detective Archer." It was Helen Reed. Her voice was quiet, steady, but different. Something in it had shifted, as if a tension she had held for days had finally been released. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You've lifted this terrible burden from us." A pause. "We are all devastated that Danny could have been capable of this. It's so painful. But thanks to you, we can now try to move on." Archer stopped on the bottom step, just listening. Her words were perfect. Grief, gratitude, a cautious hope for the future. Not a word out of place, not a single crack in the performance. "Mrs. Reed," he said, "the case isn't officially closed. There are still procedural formalities." Archer stepped out onto the street. The raw November air hit him in the face. He lit a cigarette and stood on the precinct steps without moving. Where a normal person would feel relief, he felt only a void. She had called him immediately. She hadn't asked when the seals would be removed. She hadn't asked for details. She was closing the book. The rain started at midnight, a short, angry downpour that lasted until 3. Archer sat in his worn-out armchair, staring at his laptop. On the screen was the recording of Daniel's interrogation. He hit play for the 5th time, though by now he knew every pause, every hitch in breath by heart. On the screen, Daniel sat with his head bowed. His shoulders weren't tense, but collapsed, as if some internal support structure had broken. "I'd give anything to have him back," he said quietly, not looking at the camera. "Anything." His voice didn't just break. It tore, like a frayed thread snapping. Archer stopped the video. In 20 years, he had learned what a guilty man cornered looks like. A guilty man defends himself, even in silence. He holds something back, walls it off, controls the space around him. A guilty man has a core of steel because he has a secret. Daniel had nothing but grief. Archer rubbed the scar on his left palm. Slowly, with the thumb of his right hand tracing the uneven ridge, a subconscious automatic movement. He remembered another young man, years ago, with that same empty stare. That kid was 19. He'd gotten out of prison 5 years later with dead eyes and hands that trembled when he held a glass of water. Archer had been sitting in the 3rd row during the exoneration hearing, just watching those hands. "Not again," he said into the darkness of his apartment. The silence answered only with the sound of rain against the window. In the morning, without having written a single word of the final report waiting on his desk, Archer got in his car and drove back to Elm Street. The garage was just past the kitchen door, 20 feet from the trash can where the dropper was found. Archer entered through the back, past the dripping faucet and the row of spice jars on the shelf. The garage met him with the smell of gasoline and cold metal. Bright, shadowless fluorescent light illuminated a space that had no room for lies. Tools hung on a pegboard in perfect order, wrenches by size, screwdrivers on hooks, everything clean and in its place. He ran a hand over the steel workbench. Cold, smooth. The edges were stained with oil that had seeped into the metal's pores over years of work. He stood in the middle of the garage, thinking of the two men who had likely spent the best hours of their relationship here. One fixing engines, the other watching, perhaps smoking by the door. Or maybe they just worked in a comfortable silence, the kind that supports rather than crushes. He scanned the shelves, technical manuals neatly arranged. A few notebooks filled with diagrams, figures, and notes in the margins. Daniel had kept them meticulously, in a small, even script, the handwriting of someone who was praised for his neatness in school and never forgot it. That's not the handwriting of a killer, Archer thought with stark clarity. It's the handwriting of someone who is trying. The garage door slid open. Anne stood in the entryway. She wore a gray coat, her face was pale, and the rims of her eyes were red. She clearly hadn't slept. She saw Archer and froze. "What are you doing here?" Her voice cracked, not quite a shout, but broken from the first word. "Just looking around," Archer said calmly. "The case is closed." She stepped inside. "The killer has been arrested. You have no business here." "Anne, I'm just—" "Get out!" She lunged at him, her hands pressing against his chest. "Leave his things alone. Leave all of us alone." She tried to push him toward the exit, her hands trembling, her movements fueled not by strength, but by a raw, naked desperation. Archer caught her by the wrists, gently, without force. "What are you afraid of?" he asked quietly. She stared at him, her eyes filled with tears and something else. The look of a person who has been carrying a heavy burden for so long, they've grown tired of pretending it isn't there. "You don't understand anything," she said, her voice softer now. "You'll ruin everything. Why? Why do you need to do this?" "What exactly will I ruin?" She tore her wrists away, stumbled back, and slid down the wall until she was crouching on the floor. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Archer didn't move. He watched her. Anne wasn't screaming because he was interfering with an investigation. She was screaming because she was afraid of something specific, something hidden in this garage. People don't have hysterics over nothing. In the far corner stood an old metal desk, not a workbench, but a proper desk with drawers, its sides still bearing the remnants of faded blue paint. Paul's desk. Archer had seen ones like it in old government offices, heavy, indestructible, built to outlast generations of owners. The top drawer was locked with a small inset lock. Archer pulled a small flat pry bar from his pocket. He'd kept it in his glove compartment for 7 years, ever since a case where he'd had to force a safe with his bare hands. A slow and painful mistake. Anne lifted her head. "Don't," she said, her voice low, like someone who knows they are too late. Archer wedged the pry bar into the gap between the drawer and the desktop. He pressed down. The metal groaned in protest. A second push, and the lock snapped from its housing with a sharp crack. The echo died in the silence of the garage. Inside lay a stack of old invoices, a few warranty cards for equipment, and a broken pencil. And beneath it all, a sheet of graph paper folded into quarters. Archer unfolded it. He recognized the handwriting immediately, not because he'd seen it before, but because it matched the man who had been described to him. Large, confident, with a heavy, forceful pressure. The hand of a man accustomed to his word being law. "An addendum to my will," the letter began. Archer read it slowly. Paul had written it without legal jargon, without ambiguity. His entire share of the auto repair business, the equipment, the client list, the contracts, everything, was to be transferred to Daniel Price. And then, a line underlined twice in dark ink. He was a true, loyal friend to me, the only person I trusted in this damned house. Archer lowered the sheet. The garage was silent. Anne wasn't crying anymore. She was looking at Archer with the expression of someone whose worst fears had just been confirmed.
The motive for Daniel, envy, resentment, humiliation, had just evaporated into thin air. There was no humiliation. There was trust. There was no resentment. There was a legacy. Archer folded the paper and put it in his pocket. Anne didn't move. "You knew?" he asked. She was silent for a long time. "Paul told me, shortly before." She trailed off. "He said he wanted to make things right." "And you didn't tell anyone?" "I was afraid," she whispered. Archer walked out of the garage, leaving Anne sitting against the wall. He sat in his car without starting the engine, his hands resting on the steering wheel. He stared at the house's white facade through the windshield, at the crack running from the cornice, the shuttered second-floor windows, the sculpted evergreens by the gate. He dialed Captain Miller's number. "Archer." Miller answered on the first ring, as if he'd been expecting the call. "Is your report written?" "Miller, we made a mistake." A pause. "What?" "Daniel Price is innocent. I found a draft of Paul's will in the garage. He was leaving him the entire business. There's no motive." The silence on the other end lasted for 3 seconds. Then Miller spoke, his voice low, but tight with a pressure worse than shouting. "Archer, the case is closed. It's been reported upstairs. We arrested the wrong man. Archer!" This time his voice finally broke. "Are you out of your mind? We have a witness, a poison purchase, and physical evidence. And you want to throw all that away because of some piece of paper you found God knows where?" "The paper is in Paul Reed's handwriting," Archer said. "I'll send you a photo." "I am forbidding you from pursuing this any further. Do you hear me? That's an order. You will write your report and you will close this case." Archer ended the call. He lit a cigarette, the smoke curling toward the car's ceiling. He cracked the window. Miller wasn't a bad man. Miller was a functional one. He saw a folder with a name and a seal, and to him, that was the truth. The fact that the name belonged to a living person with honey-colored eyes and hands that didn't know how to lie, that didn't fit in the folder. Archer tossed the half-smoked cigarette out the window. He got home at 9:30. He stood before the corkboard and stared at it for a long time. Then he unpinned Daniel's photograph from the center, the one he had placed 3 days ago under the pencil-scrawled word, "Killer." He set it aside. The center of the board was now empty. Archer took a step back, his eyes scanning the remaining faces and facts. Who planted the dropper? Who led the police to that specific pharmacy? Who knew Daniel had bought a veterinary drug 3 weeks ago for a client's farm animals? A detail Archer had learned on the first day from Daniel himself, who had thought nothing of it. Who had access to the kitchen, the trash cans, the Sunday dinner routine? Who had lived in this house for 50 years and knew its every secret like the back of her own hand? Archer's gaze moved slowly from Anne's photo, too frightened to be a strategist, to Irene's, too loud, too obvious. And then it stopped on Helen. A small, fragile woman with a straight back and silver pearls. Her face in the photograph was as still as stone. Her blue eyes looked just past the lens, observing, assessing, giving nothing away. Archer picked up a pencil. Helen Reed didn't get a dime from her son's death. The insurance money went to Anne. The business, according to Paul's final wishes, was meant for Daniel. No money, no assets. But the house.
The house remained. Paul had been planning to sell it. Irene had said as much in the foyer, an offhand remark. He kept us all on a financial leash. Selling the house would have cut that leash. It would have been the end of her power, the end of the 50-year dynasty she had built from within, room by room, person by person. Without the house, she would be just an old woman living in someone else's apartment. Archer pinned a new index card to the center of the board and wrote her name on it. He stared at it. She didn't buy the poison. Daniel had, for an innocent reason, and the pharmacist remembered his face. She found a way to use that. She wedged the splinter into the dumbwaiter, after the fact, to ensure no one would look there too quickly. She had jammed her own alibi, blocking the one path that could have led the investigation straight to her. Archer rubbed the scar on his palm with his thumb. It had been a chess game, and he had been a pawn. He walked to the window. The lights of the city glowed below, the East River reflecting them in cold, shimmering streaks. He watched the water. Daniel was in a holding cell, a young man with honest eyes and grease under his nails. The only person in that house who didn't know how to lie, which was precisely why he was the most convenient target. Archer turned away from the window. Miller would take him off the case. It would happen tomorrow morning, as soon as he walked into the precinct. He foresaw it with the same certainty that he knew the crack in the Reed Mansion's facade had nothing to do with the foundation settling. Archer sat down in his armchair and pulled the toxicology report from a folder. He had read it 3 times already, but now, with this new understanding, he read it again, more slowly, line by line. On the 3rd page, under the section for additional findings, the lab listed all the substances detected in Paul Reed's blood. The neurotoxin, a negligible amount of alcohol, food metabolites, and, noted as a trace concentration, likely therapeutic, a benzodiazepine sedative. Archer read the line again. A trace concentration, likely therapeutic. The lab hadn't flagged it. Next to a lethal dose of neurotoxin, who would dwell on traces of a common tranquilizer? Archer froze. A sedative. In the blood of a man being killed with a neurotoxin. Why would you calm someone you were about to kill, unless you weren't calming them for the murder? You were calming them so they would sit still, stay in their seat, not get up from the table, so they wouldn't disrupt the perfect aim of the poisoner. Archer closed the report. Someone had given Paul a sedative before dinner. Someone with prior access to his food or drink. Someone who was prescribed benzodiazepines, or knew where to get them. He opened his laptop and started typing a query into the medical database he still, for now, had access to. Miller would shut it down tomorrow, which meant he had until sunrise.